Every country had its own small people's car, simple and affordable. For Germany, it was the Beetle. For Britain, the Mini. For France, the Citroën 2CV. For the Soviet Union, the Zaporozhets. And for Poland, the Maluch, the Fiat 126. The design came from Italy, but it was the Polish version that became truly widespread. It turned into a symbol of the Edward Gierek era, the 1970s, when Poland took out loans, built new factories, and tried to catch up with the rest of Europe. The Fiat 126 was small and simple, but for many Polish families it became their first real car, modest, basic, yet entirely their own. And in this video, we'll explore the story behind this little but important machine, how the Polish Fiat was almost produced in the Soviet Union, and the unusual kit cars built on its tiny platform. After World War II, Poland's automotive industry struggled to get off the ground. In the 1950s, the country built its first post-war car, the Warszawa, essentially a licensed copy of the Soviet Gaz M20 Pobeda. A bit later came the Serena, Poland's own design. But the Warszawa aged quickly. By the early 1960s, it was outdated in every way. Styling, engineering, fuel economy, and updating it made little sense. In theory, Poland could have adopted the Soviets' next-generation car, the Volga, introduced in 1956. But the Volga simply wasn't a fit for Poland. It was big, thirsty, and more of an official's car, something for factory directors, high-ranking officers, and party bureaucrats, not for ordinary workers. And Moscow wasn't exactly eager to share the Volga with Poland anyway. The Serena couldn't fill the gap either. It was underdeveloped, unreliable, and produced in small numbers. Early cars were practically hand-built. So by the mid-1960s, it became clear Poland needed a new small car, affordable, modern, and suitable for true mass production. Before Edward Gierek came to power, Poland was led by Władysław Gomułka, who served as first secretary from 1956 to 1970. Gomułka openly opposed the idea of widespread private car ownership. He believed most Poles simply couldn't afford their own vehicles and often joked that a Polish farmer can get to church just fine on a horse cart. Convincing him to approve the production of a licensed passenger car was a long and difficult process. Italy's Fiat became the natural partner. Poland had cooperated with the company even before World War II, so the relationship was already established. But as soon as the deal neared completion, doubts started to appear inside Poland. Many argued that the country didn't need large, expensive sedans, and that it would be far more sensible to focus on small, economical cars instead. Poland's Prime Minister Józef Cyrankiewicz, who supported the idea of motorizing the country, shut down these discussions immediately. He feared that any hesitation might push Gomułka to abandon the project altogether. So he insisted on moving forward exactly as planned. In early 1966, Poland finally signed the agreement to produce the Fiat 125. A year later, the first cars rolled off the FSO assembly line. And it quickly became clear that the critics had at least one valid point. The Polish Fiat 125 was simply too big and too expensive for the majority of Polish families. When Edward Gierek came to power in 1970, Poland began to change rapidly. The country's image abroad improved, Western loans became accessible, and cooperation with Western Europe started to grow. The new leadership took a far more pragmatic and open approach to economic development. Automotive policy changed as well. The idea of widespread private car ownership no longer faced resistance. Instead, affordable cars were written directly into the government's modernization program as a way to raise living standards and catch up with the rest of Europe. And finding a cheaper, more accessible alternative to the Fiat 125 didn't take long. The Italians already had a suitable model, and they were ready to offer it to Poland. In 1972, at the Turin Motor Show, Fiat unveiled its new small car, the Fiat 126. It was designed to replace the legendary Fiat 500. So many of its solutions were carried over. The same wheelbase, the same rear engine layout, and the same tiny two-cylinder, air-cooled engine mounted behind the rear seats. By the early 1970s, most of the automotive world was switching to front-wheel drive layouts. But Fiat stayed with the familiar rear-engine formula. a design proven over decades, though already outdated and with little future ahead of it. Interestingly, in Italy, the 126 never became a full successor to the iconic 500. By that time, Italians were living well enough to want something more modern and more spacious. That role fell to the Fiat 127, a front-wheel drive car with water cooling and a much more grown-up driving character. It quickly became popular and even won the 1972 European Car of the Year award. The Fiat 126 remained a simple city car. Its 594 cubic centimeter engine produced 23 horsepower, enough for daily commuting, but nothing more. Acceleration from 0 to 60 miles per hour took what felt like an eternity, about 48 seconds, and the top speed was around 65 miles per hour. In 1977, the engine was enlarged slightly to 652 cubic centimeters. The power output stayed almost the same, but torque increased from 39 to 43 newton meters, which made the car feel a bit stronger at low speeds. Comfort in the 3-meter-long body was minimal. The trunk offered about 100 liters of space. 4 people could fit inside, though in practice the rear seat was usually reserved for children or luggage. Still, Fiat's engineers used every centimeter wisely. The tiny 12-inch wheels, compact drivetrain layout, and the absence of a bulky cooling system gave the interior as much room as possible for a car of this size. Poland began preparing for the new car long before it ever appeared on local roads. In 1971, the country created a dedicated company, FSM, built specifically to launch licensed production of a small, affordable Fiat. On June 6, 1973, the first Polski Fiat 126p was assembled in Bielsko-Biała from Italian-supplied parts. Just a month later, full-scale production was underway. A second plant in Tychy soon joined in, and it was this factory that ultimately turned the Maluch into a true mass-market car. But even the cheapest car in Poland was anything but cheap. Its price equaled several years of an average salary, and you couldn't simply walk into a dealership and buy one. You first had to obtain a special purchase coupon, essentially a government-issued permission slip that allowed you to buy a car in the first place. Even with that coupon in hand, the wait could stretch 3 to 5 years, sometimes even longer. But once a lucky buyer finally drove out of the dealership, something familiar to the entire Eastern Bloc happened. The car's value instantly doubled. And it wasn't a black market trick. Such resales were completely legal in Poland and across the socialist world. Still, after so many years of waiting, very few owners were willing to part with their Maluch, even for serious money. The Fiat 126 wasn't built only in Poland. It was also produced under license in Yugoslavia at the Zastava factory, which is why so many of them could be seen on Serbian roads for years afterward. There were other unexpected versions as well. Around 2,000 cars were assembled in Austria and sold as the Steyr 126p4. In Denmark, the model carried the historic name Topolino, and in Australia it appeared as the Nicky. And importantly, all of these cars were built under the Polish license, not the Italian one. Right-hand drive versions existed too, sold in the United Kingdom under the names Saloon and DeVille. But perhaps the most unusual variant of the Fiat 126 nearly appeared not in Europe at all, but in the Soviet Union. Soviet microcars with hand controls, meant mainly for disabled veterans, were already outdated the moment they appeared. Even the later S3D model from 1970 remained painfully primitive. A flimsy body, a weak motorcycle engine, little comfort, and constant breakdowns. Both owners and the engineers at the Serpukhov plant knew it couldn't continue this way. So, in the late 1970s, the plant initiated a project for a modern, reliable microcar. But a small factory like SMZ couldn't develop an all-new vehicle without support from the top. That support came from Viktor Polyakov, the USSR's Minister of the Automotive Industry. The project was handed to the NAMI Research Institute, whose engineers quickly outlined a concept: a front-wheel drive microcar about 3 meters long with an air-cooled engine and a belt-driven CVT. The big question was the engine. Motorcycle units were rejected and the Soviet industry had nothing suitable. But the Poles did, the power plant from the Fiat 126. Several cars were purchased and tested at NAMI, and one was even fitted with hand controls. The results were promising, and a licensed Soviet production of the Fiat seemed possible. But the Maluch had two non-negotiable flaws for the project: rear engine layout and rear-wheel drive, both rejected at the very beginning. Engineers still tried to work around it. Two prototypes, named NAMI 0219, were built by moving the Fiat's engine to the front. The front end had to be lengthened and the engine mounted transversely, but the redesign turned out too complex and expensive. The Fiat body was abandoned, and work shifted to a new Soviet body, the one that would later evolve into the Lada Oka. The Polish engine, however, was still seen as a good fit, and both sides were ready to cooperate. For Poland, it meant extra revenue; for the USSR, a ready, reliable power unit. It looked like a mutually beneficial deal was just about to happen. But everything changed in the summer of 1980, when a massive worker strike erupted at the Gdansk shipyard. The solidarity movement grew rapidly. The protests spread far beyond economic issues, and soon the unrest engulfed almost the entire country. In December 1981, the Polish government declared martial law. Overnight, Poland faced serious problems, not only with Western nations, which condemned the crackdown, but even within the socialist bloc itself. Moscow offered formal political support, but real economic cooperation became nearly impossible. Production collapsed, supply chains broke down, and shortages of everything from fuel to food made stable trade unrealistic. At the same time, the Soviet leadership feared that similar protests could spread to other Eastern Bloc countries, so relations with Poland were quietly but sharply restricted. Under these conditions, any joint industrial project lost its viability. As a result, the Soviet Union abandoned the idea of using the Polish Fiat engine, and cooperation on the microcar project came to an end. In Poland itself, production of the Maluch continued despite the turbulent years. In 1984, the car received its first noticeable update: plastic bumpers, a more modern dashboard, and a handful of small body revisions. By 1987, the changes reached the engine as well. Fiat introduced a two-cylinder, liquid-cooled, horizontally opposed unit. The new 126 bis made 26 horsepower, but, as you might expect, it didn't really change the way the little Fiat drove. Even after Poland shifted to a market economy, the 126p stayed on the assembly line. In 1994, the car went through another facelift, using some components from the Fiat Cinquecento and receiving the designation 126EL. In 1997, a catalytic converter was added, creating the ELX version. But everyone understood that the little Fiat's days were numbered. The updates helped, but they couldn't hide the fact that the design itself belonged to another era. And in 2000, the story finally ended. Production stopped in October, marked by a farewell run of bright yellow and red cars called Happy End, the last chapter in the history of the Maluch. Beyond its standard forms, the Fiat 126 also became the basis for several kit car projects, at least 3 of them. In the early 1980s, Italian racer Aurelio Beccia built a small coupe inspired by American muscle cars. Under its fiberglass body was a tubular steel frame and the usual Fiat 126 mechanicals. So despite the aggressive look, performance stayed the same. About 30 were made before the project ended. In the mid-1990s, another attempt appeared in the UK, this time a buggy built around the same Fiat 126 drivetrain. Roughly 20 kits were produced. A third British project came from Norfolk, where between 1993 and 1995, around 10 kits were built, styled after the classic Fiat 500. Unlike the previous attempts, these were based on the full Fiat 126 chassis, not just its components. In just under 3 decades, Fiat built 1.35 million units of the 126 in Italy, and another 3.32 million were produced in Poland. That makes the 126p the most manufactured Polish car in history. In Poland, it became a true cultural icon, a car people joked about, complained about, and yet drove every single day. It was humble, imperfect, sometimes even funny, but deeply loved. And without exaggeration, it stands as one of the most important small cars in post-war Europe.